Good afternoon to all of you who are online with us. I'm truly delighted to welcome you all in this international conference on data technologies, new approaches to better regulation under the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the EU. This conference represents the culmination of the intense work that has been taken place over the last few months of the Portuguese presidency, particularly within the scope of the Better Regulation Working Party. After intense discussions and demonstrations on how data technologies could support new approaches to improve better regulation, the Council conclusions of the Working Party were adopted by the Council on the 27th May, and a very clear message was sent on the possible relevance of these new approaches to the future of better lawmaking. It is well known that better regulation plays an important role in fostering growth, the green and digital transitions, and ultimately the proper functioning of the single market. These Council conclusions adopted under the Portuguese presidency highlight the importance of applying data technologies at European, national, and regional levels in order to improve the European Union policy cycle. This will also contribute, for sure, to the EU's efforts to be a world leader in a data-driven economy. In order to broaden the exchange of views in this very interesting topic, we have invited important guests to share their vision on how data technologies may or are already supporting better regulation procedures and tools. During this conference, we will hear an opening intervention by the Minister of State for the Presidency, Ms. Mariana Vieira da Silva, and afterwards, Mr. Manuel Cabugueira, head of the Portuguese Technical Unit for Impact Assessment, will make a presentation on the topic Better Regulation, New Technologies to Face New and Old Challenges. The panel discussion on data technologies in support of better regulation will have the interventions of Mr. Maros Šefčovič, Vice President of the European Commission for Interinstitutional Relations and Foresight, of Ms. Maria Manuel Leitão Marques, Member of the European Parliament, and Mr. Jeffrey Schallenhauf, Deputy Secretary General on the OECD. Unfortunately, due to last-minute agenda constraints, Mr. Maros is unable to actively participate in the panel, but we will have a recorded video speech to share with all of you. I also must announce a second change in the agenda due to an unforeseen medical situation, non-COVID related. Ms. Ellen Shantaki, chair of the IAL, will not be attending the conference. In her place, we will have Mr. João Tiago Silveira, also a board member of IAL. After our guests finish their interventions, we will have an open debate, and we are counting on your participation through the chat on your screens. Mr. Cabugueira will moderate the debate and is willing to share all your views and questions with the panelists. The closing session of this conference will be held by Mr. André Moscaldas, Secretary of State for the Presidency of the Council of Ministers. We are sure that this will be a very interesting session to all participants in order to learn and share views on new approaches to better regulation through innovation and data technologies. Now, I would like to welcome our Minister of State for the Presidency for her intervention, Ms. Mariana Vieira da Silva. I give you the floor.
Good afternoon to you all. I would like to congratulate the Center for Legal Skills and Impact Assessment Unit for this initiative. Today we are hosting a conference on the topic that crosses different challenges we are facing, that directly touch upon policy making and that portrays some of the assessment work often less visible, that underlies our laws and policies, aiming to increase the efficiency of their outcomes, transparency, and effectiveness. In fact, ensuring our policies are evidence-based is a precondition to success and the responsibility we assume towards our citizens and businesses. Therefore, my first point is how informed and evidence-based approaches respond directly to one of our main priorities, setting in motion a recovery of Europe. COVID-19 has impacted our countries and our daily lives, and the European Union came forward, designing a collective, unprecedented response to the crisis. For instance, on the outset of the pandemic, the SURE facility helped protecting employment. Afterwards, considering the social and economic medium and long-term impacts of COVID, a strategy was needed to recover Europe and prepare it for its future. When the Portuguese presidency took over the Council of the EU, it defined as motto, time to deliver a fair, green and digital recovery. During our presidency, we have aimed to advance as much as possible the necessary frameworks to start the recovery, boost our economies, and prepare Europe and its citizens for the challenges that lie ahead, both green and digital transitions. Besides the multi-annual financial framework, a new facility was agreed upon, the Next Generation EU, to provide financial support to national recovery and resilience plans. Since then, we have seen important developments. Recently, the own resources decision was ratified by all member states, and their national plans are being delivered to the European Commission. In essence, we are taking the necessary steps to put these instruments in place and enact important reforms to our economic and social systems. For those reasons, it is all the more necessary that our policies are built within efficient frameworks that attain concrete, satisfying results. That is why we should not overlook the added value and the principles of better regulation. Informed policies and assessments will prove essential to deliver future-proof strategies. We should be able to see what is working best and where are we underperforming in order to implement the necessary changes and adjustments. This is essential for decision-making and increases the chances for success of the policies we are implementing. And that leads me to my second point. Digital transition is shaping our society and will shape our future. It is a strategic priority of the Union, and we should make good use of the doors it opens. The lockdowns have tested our capacity to operate daily. Our physical and digital worlds were further integrated. Most of us experienced working from home and connecting regularly with friends and family, except now through a screen. In that sense, new technologies have proved essential, and we have to continue making the most of the digital transition and especially the great potential it represents to our development. This is true to different areas of our society, such as health, education, or labor. And it also brings new challenges, for example, concerning digital skills and cybersecurity. And of course, new data technologies can help improve lawmaking, impact assessment, and through these means, increase transparency. In a context where all pieces of legislation must be closely assessed, its costs and savings determined and their results driven by efficiency and burden reduction, technological developments are a useful tool. Accordingly, any means we employ to increase efficiency and foster better regulation tend to meet the expectations of a society that, very positively, is demanding more transparency. It is a responsibility we share. However, the same responsibility we assume towards our citizens in increasing efficiency and transparency must be equally present when applying new technological solutions with due regard for ethical standards and protection of fundamental rights. Efficient regulatory frameworks relying on the perks of digitalization must go hand in hand with the standards of democratic societies. It is not a trade-off, but an essential condition based on a human-centered approach to the use of technology. In a nutshell, we should welcome data technology to achieve better regulation, but always recalling that we must only go as far as the core principles of our democratic societies allow. And finally, my last remarks go to the work of the Portuguese Presidency in this area. In fact, this webinar summarizes our main priority in this area. We have just adopted Council conclusions on how to promote the use of data technologies in support of high-quality legislation. And it is very important to see Member States gathered around this idea. The idea that to ensure an efficient, effective, and sustainable economy that must promote the resilience of our economies and societies, we must have a EU regulatory framework that recognizes 4 crucial dimensions. First, better regulation is a key driver of sustainable growth and underlies our efforts to promote innovation and the overall competitiveness of our economies. Second, the legislation we approve and implement must meet the needs of increasingly digital economies that will ultimately support job creation, transform our economies, and prepare the European Union to the future. Third, that all these actions will work in a two-way approach, mutually beneficial, where better regulation helps in facilitating digitalization, and digitalization contributes directly to increase of the efficiency of the policies we put forward. And finally, that we respect the fundamental rights and freedoms of our citizens when using these technologies, as well as the core principles of democratic societies. I know that we are all jointly working in this effort. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish you a very fruitful conference.
Portugal assume a presidência do Conselho da União Europeia durante o primeiro semestre de 2021. É a oportunidade para promover uma agenda atual para a União Europeia, indo ao encontro dos cidadãos europeus, das suas ambições, dos seus interesses e assuntos, dos desafios globais que têm impacto nas suas vidas. É um reencontro dos Estados-membros numa altura de extrema importância para a coesão e solidariedade da equipa europeia em torno dos seus valores, metas e objetivos de crescimento. As transformações que se fazem sentir em todo o mundo e nos afetam a todos merecem da União Europeia respostas sustentáveis, responsáveis, globais. A presidência portuguesa vai destacar a forma global e integrada com que a União Europeia responde aos grandes desafios da modernidade. A Europa social, a transformação digital, as preocupações ambientais, a abertura a outras regiões do mundo. A resiliência da Europa assenta na solidez das suas respostas e modelos de desenvolvimento, que colocam os cidadãos no centro do projeto europeu e que contam com a coesão e solidariedade das suas comunidades para superar as adversidades, nunca deixando ninguém para trás. Portugal assume a presidência do Conselho da União Europeia com a naturalidade da sua liderança, no diálogo com outras regiões do globo e com os seus exemplos de boas práticas nas políticas de desenvolvimento, demonstrando a resiliência do modelo social europeu. Portugal vai projetar uma mensagem de solidariedade e de confiança no futuro, promovendo o país na Europa e no mundo, destacando a sustentabilidade ambiental e social, a globalização responsável, o acesso à tecnologia e à digitalização. A partir do Centro Cultural de Belém, centro operacional da Presidência, as atividades e reuniões vão alargar-se a outras cidades de Portugal e a palcos virtuais por streaming e videoconferência com outros Estados-membros. Uma presidência digital em que a tecnologia e a inovação aproximam a Europa e os cidadãos. Esta visão integrada afirma Portugal como protagonista global aberto ao mundo, que assume o seu papel condutor da União Europeia por ocasião da presidência. Presidência Portuguesa do Conselho da União Europeia. Tempo de agir por uma recuperação justa, verde e digital.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a huge pleasure to welcome you all to Lisbon. Let me start by going a little bit off topic, just to thank the initial words by the Minister Mariana Vieira da Silva. I'm the coordinator of the Unit for Technical Impact Assessment, Technical Impact Assessment for legislation, and it is clear now, after what we have heard, that we are fully committed in Portugal in what regards implementation of the better regulation program and impact assessment tools. So I must start by thanking the Minister for her very kind words regarding not only our work but the importance and the relevance of better regulation. Now let me go to the topic. I was asked to share with you some thoughts on the topic of data technology and better regulation. This has been the subject that has been on our minds during the last 5 months of the Portuguese presidency, the topic that we brought into the presidency to be discussed within the Better Regulation Working Party. And during the next minutes, what I would like to do is to share with you some of the doubts, the difficulties, the challenges, the opportunities that we saw in this topic, and hopefully at the end we will look at this not only in a very positive way in what regards the possibilities that these new technologies opened regarding the use of better regulation, but also we will also be aware of the risks and challenges that lie ahead. I will start my presentation, if I may. Thank you very much. So first of all, and I will not go through this five principles or five priorities of the Portuguese presidency. They were already presented by the Minister Mariana Vieira da Silva. Let me just remind you that all our presidency was built on the idea that we need to recover, that we need to be resilient, that we need to prepare for the future. But prepare for the future, take into account the challenges and the opportunities of the digital and green transaction, and at the same time having a very responsive view on the necessity to guarantee social equality, not only within the current generations, but also looking at future generations. Also, a final priority, obviously, promote competitiveness of the European economy and the open and the importance of opening up to the world and to other economies. Within this framework, the subject of better regulation was placed at a very high level. It is clear in our program that we wanted to bring this topic to the discussion, and we wanted to highlight its importance. It is also very relevant to say that the relevance of the topic was already very well established by the TRIO program. So our colleagues from Germany, from Slovenia, and ourselves on the joint program that we presented, we immediately placed better regulation at a high position in the agenda, making it clear that this was a topic that is relevant for the overall development of the European economy and the European society. In our presidency, we wanted to bring a more practical issue into the discussion. So we brought the discussion around how we can use new data technologies to support and to promote better regulations. This brought a lot of new challenges, this brought a lot of discussion, and obviously it highlighted the risks and the risks that we are facing and that we should overcome. I will start with a very short movie, a very short film of what went on in my mind during the last 5 months. Let me just start by giving you a preview of what I was thinking about and what were the challenges that I had to overcome during these first 5 months. So the initial goal was to look at how new digital technologies could help us, practitioners of better regulation, to face old and new difficulties that are part of our daily challenge. We know that better regulation is about supporting decision-making through the use of evidence-based approach anchored in the transparent relation with the stakeholders, as was already underlined. The objective is to improve competitiveness of national and European economies, reinforce the functioning of the single market, promoting social well-being and economic growth. Within this framework, the European Better Regulation Programme was developed during the last decades, progressing on 4 main objectives. First, it focused on the improvement of the quality of the European legislation and the drafting in itself. It then focused on guaranteeing that it was fit for future, which means that it was fit for purpose, which means to be effective, efficient and predictable, and able to avoid unnecessary burdens. A third step was to respond to the fast green, social and digital changes, disruptive in their timing and velocity. These new transitions have been embraced by the European Union and are now part of our common objectives, demanding a regulation that is fit for future, innovative, friendly and sustainable. Finally, we now face the necessity of being resilient, capable of recovering from the recent pandemic situation and prepare the society and the economy for unexpected and unperceived future events. How does better regulation respond to these changes? It looks at the legislative process as a regulatory cycle that should be transparent and supported by a continuous use of evidence produced by impact assessments, evaluations and foresight analysis. The question we have been raising during the Portuguese presidency is how data technology can help to accomplish those results using new digital tools. Making regulation more adaptive to a fast-changing world and more attentive to the and more attentive to the silent and overlooked groups of the society. To implement these new technologies, we do know that we have to implement new data policies, and we have been seeing the effort of the European institutions during the last years and last months to implement such instruments. So this word cloud is a first image that I would like to share with you of the different aspects, the different challenges that, as I was saying, went through my mind during the last five months. I will now look at the specific topic of data technologies. In our understanding of the meaning of data technologies, we use the definition that was proposed to us by the Joint Research Center. And we look at the data technologies as all the solutions that allow us to work with big data sets. So we will be including as data technologies not only the data analytical tools, but also all the algorithmic approaches as artificial intelligence analysis or machine learning algorithms that will allow us to work with big data and to retrieve from those data sets relevant information that can support our work and can support decision making. We have a very broad vision of these instruments, and we are not only considering in our speech and in our position the instruments related with loops of learning, but also other language processing techniques or other decision-making processes that are based in rules. So I do understand that this is a concept that might be not very well established and it might be subject to discussion, but we have this broad view of data technologies as all different tools that will allow us to retrieve from big data relevant information to support decision making. When we talk about big data, what are we talking about? We are talking about huge amounts of information that is brought to us almost at a real time, almost in real time, that has different sources and it is heterogeneous. And this is the overall definition of big data. This is the same definition that is being discussed throughout the world when, for instance, we find a book by Professor Zulog from the Harvard University and her discussion on the new market for behavioral futures and difficulties that that market can bring into the future development of the economy. We do know that firms and the private firms are already looking at this market and using this information to improve their results and to improve their approach to the market. We now would like to discuss how can the government, the public decision-making institutions use that same information to also become more efficient and more effective in their and more equitable in their intervention. Before we go ahead, and I do know that I'm going to go a little bit off topic, I would also like to mention the relevance of the traditional data sets. I do know that when we talk about national statistics, micro statistics on firm and citizens' behavior, we are not talking about big data on the sense that it is the traditional information that is provided by us by the national institutional statistical departments, but I also believe that the new IT solutions that are being used to work with big data can be used to improve the quality of the traditional statistics that are being provided to decision making. We now have the possibility of working closer to the statistical offices. We have the opportunity to have access to more robust, more complete data sets of traditional statistics that will help us in our day-to-day life. I will come back to this later on. Looking at this overall picture, what we will be discussing during the next minutes will be what we now call Regulation 2.0, what the OECD is now presenting to us as Regulation 2.0. And for people that like to discuss regulation, this new idea of Regulation 2.0 is very interesting. We are now facing an approach to the public intervention that is completely different from the ones that we've been discussing for the last century. For the last century, our approach to public intervention regulation was mostly based on a top-down approach, focusing on the failures of the market. So we start by observing a market failure, and then we continue to discuss what could be the solutions. Now that we have access to these big data sets, what we now have is the possibility of having not a top-down, but to invert the approach and to start by looking at what is happening in the market. So we can decide on the public intervention, having access to real data, real information of what is happening at the micro level in the market and start building from that. That is a huge change, and that is the reason why we can start talking about this new approach to data, to regulation. What can we do with these new tools? How can we use these new tools? And I'm going to bring to the debate 4 different views on how we can use these new tools. The first view is brought to us by the European Commission, in one of its first reports on the subject of artificial intelligence. And the European Commission starts by telling us that we could use artificial intelligence to support regulation and support public intervention, because it will allow us to have a better understanding in real time of the process and of the needs of the market. We now have shorter and richer feedback loops that will allow us to understand not only what are the perceived impacts, but what are the real impacts of a public intervention. And that introduce a new dynamic of revision in the public intervention. The refit programs that are so relevant at European level and should be so relevant at any member state level, the idea of reviewing and reviewing the public intervention can now be done in a more supported way, looking at the information that we receive in a loop regarding the impacts. Decision we also have information on the specific needs of specific groups of the society. The micro-information that is being provided to us allow us to better understand the necessities of the citizen and to get closer to the citizen. So now we can use the new technologies to have a more transparent, more dynamic relation with the citizen, with a more dynamic relation with the object of the public intervention. And with that, we believe that we can improve the overall impacts. A second idea that I would like to bring to you is the idea that was presented to us by one of the founders of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, that present to us the concepts and introduce the concept of the fourth industrial revolution. It is a very interesting concept. I'm not going to discuss if it is the fourth or if it is the third and a half industrial revolution, but for me it was very interesting to learn this position that explains the evolution of the economy throughout the last centuries, looking at transition from the muscle to the mechanical, to the computerized, to the networks, and now to the cognitive powers. On his position, on his book on the fourth economic revolution, Klaus Schwab presents to us 21 main shifts that will occur in the future. In those 21 main shifts, 2 of them were dedicated to what will come from the introduction of data technology, big data, and artificial intelligence, and how public intervention can use that information to improve its own intervention. He shared with us the relevance and how we can have innovative ways to approach the citizens, how we can use big data to enable a better and faster decision-making process, and having access to real-time data, reducing the complexity of the analysis, reducing the complexity of the process of the decision-making process on itself. And finally, it also shared with us the possibility of having a more automated and complex, a more simplified approach to what were more complex decision-making processes. We now can introduce automated decision-making instruments, tools to facilitate and to make more efficient the overall decision-making process. A final idea that I really like is the idea that if we have a data-driven intervention, if we have an evidence-driven intervention, that will make our intervention at the public level more defended in what might be irrational exuberances, in what might be personal opinions. So when we have a more robust, data-driven intervention, we should have a more efficient and effective intervention. A third idea that I would like to bring to you is the ideas that have been presented by the OECD. The OECD have been working on the data technologies and artificial intelligence and its relevance for regulation during the last years. We have been hearing about the new concept of Regulation 2.0, as I already mentioned, and I believe that during this year we will have more reports on this topic presented by the OECD and the Regulatory Policy Committee. One of those first documents was a document from 2000 and a document for 2018, and in that document the path was already set for what is now called Regulation 2.0. In that document, data was presented as an asset that should be used to promote good governance and to promote the integrity, openness and fairness of the political cycle. This new instrument, this new resource, allows the government to anticipate future events, to have a better view of what might be future trends, and with this idea, the relevance of the foresight analysis and now these new technologies can support and promote foresight analysis were brought into play. But at the same time, looking at the more traditional questions, it also made it clear that the new technologies, data-driven technologies and artificial intelligence, algorithmic approaches could support the ex-ante impact assessment analysis, as we know it, and the ex-post impact assessment analysis. A final idea is the one presented by the Joint Research Center. And let me talk a little bit about a wonderful book that the Joint Research Center from the European Commission presented at the end of last year. It is a book on science and policy. It is a very interesting handbook that refers not only to the questions regarding the use of data and artificial intelligence, but the overall use of science in support of policy making. For someone like me that comes from the academia and is now working on regulation and working in support of public decision making, it's very interesting, and it was very interesting to see the development of a very clear position that informs the society of the difficulties of using science to support policy making. And that handbook was particularly relevant at this moment in time, because many of us that have already been working on this for the last decades, we knew about these difficulties, but the society, the citizen that now saw on their day-to-day life how the politicians were making decisions regarding COVID with the support of scientists, suddenly they really understood that the information that comes from science, the help that may come from science, is relevant for policy making. So this handbook was, in my perspective, a very relevant report and a very relevant contribution for not only our discussion on data technologies, but to the overall discussion on how science can help policy making. If you look at that report, obviously we'll have a chapter, and we have a chapter that is fully dedicated to the opportunities that came from artificial intelligence when supporting policy making. And when we look at that, it is clear on the explanation that those opportunities are relevant on the overall cycle of policy making. So it is relevant, and the artificial intelligence and data technologies can help throughout the complete cycle of regulation, not only during the design, but also in the implementation and in the revision of any public decision. Regulation, and in that sense, one of the main advantages, it's the fact that we now have access to information and data regarding groups of the society that might be overlooked when we just had national overall statistics. Now that we can have access to micro data, real-time data on the implementation of policies, that will allow us to have a more needed-based approach to regulation, a more statistical centered approach to regulation that will allow us to look at otherwise overlooked groups of the society. This will allow for a more flexible approach to regulation and a more dynamic approach to regulation. As I was saying, the main issue is that we can use these instruments throughout the complete cycle of regulatory process. And just to remind many of you, this is the image that the European Commission uses to present its own virtual cycle of regulation. I believe that there is one piece that is missing in this image that I introduce now, which is also the foresight support to the overall regulatory process. What we have here is the necessity of having a complete cycle of regulation that goes from the preparation to the adaptation to the implementation and then the application of the law, that should be supported by impact assessment analysis, monitoring and evaluation, and also the overall support of foresight. All of this, as Minister Mariana Vieira da Silva said at the beginning, all of this should be implemented in a transparent way in direct relation with the stakeholders. In direct relation with stakeholders, as I was saying. Let me now turn very quickly to a couple of examples of the use of data technology to support regulation. And I will bring to you two very practical examples, one at the European level that was developed by the Joint Research Centre, and the second example of the use of data technology to support regulatory decision making that we have been developing in Portugal. The example that I'm bringing to you, and it is being developed at the European level by the Joint Research Centre, is the creation of the Semantic Text Analysis Tool, SETA. This analysis tool, using text mining analysis, allows for a better understanding of the relation of different concepts and different ideas that are presented in the overall documents that are produced daily at the European level. You have there the numbers, so there are 70 million entries of documents, either legislative documents or reports that are produced at the European level, and what this new instrument provides, it's a tool that allows to relate not only concepts but ideas that are relevant in all those documents. And it is made clear by that image that was presented by the Joint Research Centre. What we are doing is using words and giving value to the words. How? Making it clear. Making clear what is the meaning and what is the relation of the different ideas and different words throughout the different texts. Using this instrument, for instance, words like impact assessment can in a very visual way be seen on how they are used throughout the different reports and legislative documents produced at the European level. We can see their relevance, we can see their connection with other main and relevant ideas, and we can work from there not only to, for instance, analyze overlaps or duplications on legislative intervention, but also to better understand the relevance of a specific idea. As I said, a second example that I wanted to bring to you is our own example, something that we have been working here in Portugal. And during the last 2 years, in a joint collaboration with Nova University, the Unit for Technical Impact Assessments have been working on a new tool, a new artificial intelligence tool to support the estimation of administrative costs that are presented in laws. What we have been doing is developing a solution that is able to go through the text of a specific regulation, identify in that text possible obligations and transform those obligations into estimations of administrative costs. We are doing this using an artificial intelligence algorithm, a text mining algorithm that learned the syntax, that learn the relevant words, learn how to relate those words with administrative obligations, and then using standardized costs that were previously calculated, transformed that information into an estimation of costs. The final presentation of that information is made in a very simple way. As you can see, we have a very clear first idea of what might be the costs, and we can start working from there. Obviously, this is not, and this will never be the end of the end of the story. It is obviously there is an obvious necessity to go through the first analysis that is presented to us by the tool, to go through this, to decide if we accept or don't accept what are the costs that are being identified, and we have the flexibility of introducing new costs, identifying new costs, and obviously of changing the costs that are already being estimated. Throughout doing this exercise, providing more information to the tool, creating a loop of knowledge, this will improve the efficiency of the tool in itself. These were the two very practical examples that I wanted to bring to you and present to you on how we can use data technologies to support better regulation. Other examples, other proofs of concept have been discussed, and I'm sorry, I'm going to jump this, and I'll come back to this later on. Sorry for this, but other proofs of concepts can be brought to you. Have been developed throughout Europe, and in particular, we have been looking at the development of, for instance, instruments to support legal drafting. And when it comes to legal drafting, there is a lot of work that was already done at the private sector, and we are now trying to apply that same work in the support of developing drafting laws. A first example of working with this idea was developed at the end of the last century, so it was still not an artificial intelligence approach, but it was developed at the end of last century, and it was a project called LEDA. It was a project developed in Netherlands, and it was centered on using information-oriented legal drafting techniques. The main objective was to make sure that the decision maker, when was drafting a law, had as much information as he could on what were the rules that he had to comply, and what were the rules that guarantee the quality of the drafting of the law. That might be the initial step for something that is a little bit more complex, which is to teach the computer to understand what are the most relevant rules and most relevant aspects in development of the law, learn with it, and start to provide information in a knowledge loop to the drafter. That is something that was brought with a new project that is being developed at the European level, the Co-Hub Equal project, which is a new project funded by the European Commission that is centered on two main challenges. One challenge is on creating a tool for data-driven law, and the second challenge to provide a tool for code-driven law. And what are these two ideas? First idea is directly related to the first project that I mentioned. The first idea is to have artificial intelligence instruments that supports the creation of information on jurisprudence, on rules of drafting that will allow the better development of the law in itself. The second idea, the code-driven law, it's much more challenging, and that is to write the law at the same time as we are writing a code for the application of the law. And that is something related to the concept of smart contracts, smart regulation that could in itself, that could implement itself, that could monitor itself, and could create an automatic implementation of the law. This is a true challenge, and it raises a lot of questions regarding the risks that could come from the use of this kind of approaches. Besides legal drafting, we also have different examples at the European level of new projects that are being developed, for instance, to identify the duplication and the overlapping of obligations in different public interventions. So you do have different areas in the government, you have different levels of decision making, you have different levels of legislation, and it is important to understand if there are duplications, if there are overlapping obligations that can come from the different norms. We had during our presidency a presentation by our colleagues from Chile, informing us on how they are using artificial intelligence exactly to analyze their stock of legislation and to identify the overlapping of legislative obligations. Finally, the use of these new tools, as it was already mentioned, I believe from one of the main ideas that was presented by the European Commission, and I started talking about it in the beginning. Finally, we have the possibility of using these new technologies to have a better relation between the public decider and the citizens and the economy and the firms. There are now different instruments that can be used, chatbots, digital assistant messaging systems that will allow a closer relation between the decision maker and the citizens. Not only this, we can use text mining instruments to better understand what is the perception besides the reaction of the citizens to a specific law. We do know the reaction, we have access in the future to the outcomes of a law, but we never know about the perception that the society had regarding a specific public intervention. Using these new technologies, using text mining, we could have a better understanding of that perception. Finally, in different European countries, we are seeing different services providing information in multiple language, providing direct translation of texts, of laws, of reports that again support and help public intervention. To finalize, let me summarize some of these ideas. And first of all, let me start by summarizing before I summarize the final ideas, let me go back to one of the ideas that I already mentioned previously. I do know that when we talk about national statistics, we are going out of the framework of big data discussion. But again, as I said, we can see that in practice, and we do believe that IT solutions that have been developed for big data can also support the use of traditional statistics and can also make the use of traditional statistics more robust. And throughout Europe, we have been seeing the production of more information, not only regarding national statistics, but also regarding micro-statistics related to the behavior of firms and citizens, macro-statistics related to the overall behavior of the economy and the society, and we now have the possibility of start trying to develop harmonized information that could, in a very specific way, very objective way, support the work that we do in better regulation regarding impact assessment. Let me just explain very briefly how. As I said, our artificial intelligence machine that supports the analysis of impact assessment, after identifying the words that can be related to a specific administrative obligation, The next step, it will be to transform that obligation into an administrative cost. To do that final step, what we have been doing in Portugal is working directly with Portugal Statistics, with our National Statistics Office, in collaboration also with the OECD, and we have been producing harmonized statistical tables that provide harmonized information on the costs or the most relevant and most normal administrative obligations. Having said that, and now I will go to my final slides. Having said that, very briefly, let me start by summarizing what I believe are the possible positive contributions from data technology to better regulation, and then summarize what might be the risks and challenges when we use these technologies. So, when we use data technologies to support better regulation, we can expect an increase in the quality and an increase in the consistency of the law. We can use these instruments to support legal drafting, as I said. We can improve the design and the implementation of the policies, going closer to the necessities of the citizens and the firms, developing a need-based approach to regulation, not only an evidence-based, but a need-based approach to regulation, to have a more flexible and agile regulation in the sense that we will have the instruments to overcome the regulatory lag and the regulatory delay that is normal in the traditional approach to regulation. We can have a more adaptable and targeted regulation, again, going closer to the citizen, going closer to the necessities of the citizen, more efficient and timely regulation in the sense that we can provide more information in a faster way using less resources, and getting closer and into a more dynamic relation with stakeholders. This will provide high quality, fit for purpose, less burdensome, fit for future, innovative friendly, resilient regulation, and finally, why not, this will also allow for a new innovative approach to regulation that will make it easier to implement in sandboxes, for instance, or that to make it easier to implement one in, one out principles to support political decision making, and finally it can also support the implementation of behavioral approaches to regulation. These are the benefits, but we also must be attentive to the risks and the challenges. And the risks and the challenges are, first of all, the fact that we do know that we need more transparency and more knowledge about the algorithmic models that are being used. Whenever we talk about artificial intelligence, we always face the difficulties of having an implementation that could be less transparent than it should be. If we go into machine learning and deep learning instruments, it is possible that it becomes harder and harder to understand how the machine is providing us with information, how the machine is providing us with knowledge. There is the question regarding accountability of the results. Who is responsible for the information that supports the final results? And obviously, there is the necessity to guarantee that at any point, at any moment, we are defending and we are conscientious of the possibility of the risk that these new technologies bring and could increase discrimination, could increase discriminative approach to decision making. To decision making. I'm sorry. The final three ideas are that we, as again, Minister Mariana Vieira da Silva said, we need an approach to regulation that is human-centric, that respects the EU values and respects the privacy of the individual, and at any moment will respect the the private knowledge that we ourselves are providing into the machines, and that will later on support the final intervention. Finally, let me go back to the word cloud that I presented in the beginning. And let me go back to this word cloud just to make a point. The word cloud that I share with you and that explain all the difficulties and all the ideas that were raised during the last 5 months is actually the word cloud that you will find if you create a word cloud looking at the Council conclusions that were approved last week in the Council, and those were the result of the work of the Working Party on Better Regulation. So this is the word cloud that highlights the most relevant words on that Council conclusions. It misses only 4 words, and the words are, first of all, European Parliament, also Member States, Commission, and finally the Council. And these 4 words are very relevant because we do know that to improve legislation at the European level, we should work together within all European institutions and in collaboration with the Member States. I do know that I went a little bit ahead of my time, so it took a little more than 5 minutes. Well, I took 5 minutes more than I had for my presentation. I must apologize for that. I will stop now. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to come back later on to some of the ideas that I presented, but once that we are already running a little bit late, what I will propose to you is that we will immediately start the round table, and afterwards, at the end, we'll open up the floor for a discussion, and I'll be more than glad to respond or to react to any comment that you might have. So, without stopping and continue immediately with our conference, introducing our roundtable, we will have 4 interventions. The first intervention, it will be by Mr. Marko Sefcovic, Vice President of the European Commission. As it was already said, it is a record intervention, and I will leave it to you.
Good afternoon. My apologies for not participating live today, and my thanks to the Portuguese Presidency for organizing this event and inviting me to speak. At its most basic level, better regulation is about common sense. It's about creating legislation that is targeted, effective, and easy to comply with while avoiding unnecessary regulatory burdens. And while the European Commission already has a high-quality better regulation framework, a fact recognized by the OECD, there is always a room for improvement. That was the goal of our recent better regulation communication, which took a 3-fold approach. First, improving outreach. It is vital that all stakeholders play an active part in the policy-making process, from local, regional, national authorities to social partners, business, academia, and the general public. Second, we will work to reduce the costs, which inevitably come with legislation. To achieve this, we will put into effect a one-in, one-out approach. This means offsetting administrative burdens stemming from legislative proposals by reducing equivalent existing burdens in the same policy area. But this will not be applied mechanically. For example, it doesn't mean that every new piece of legislation will require an existing law to be withdrawn, only that the burdens on people and businesses must be offset. Third, we will integrate strategic foresight into our better regulation agenda. This will help us design and implement policy with a pragmatic, long-term perspective that can help achieve our strategic goals. The Commission fully shares the Council's view that data technologies and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence will play a key role in these efforts, for example, in the collection and analysis of stakeholders' contributions. These technologies could also contribute to the identification of burden reduction potential in new and existing EU legislation, including through our new Fit for Future platform. Other examples include text mining, data search and analysis. Guidance on how to design digital-ready policies and more solutions are being explored in the area of impact assessments, policy screening, monitoring and evaluation, as well as information linking and automation of processes. And this will help us in the green transition and will strengthen Europe's digital sovereignty by allowing us to set our own standards, with a clear focus on data, technology and infrastructure. Whichever way you read it, there is incredible potential for using digital technologies to demonstrate to Europeans and European businesses that the EU policy delivers for them in the most compelling way. I look forward to working with you in this effort, and I wish you a stimulating and fruitful conference.
Estamos de volta, novamente, sem direito a parar. Oh, sorry, I was talking Portuguese. Yes, I was. Terribly sorry. We are back. Things happen. We are back together. Terribly sorry for that. We are back now. Without stopping, we will continue immediately with our panel. As you could see, I already have with me the Secretary of State for the Presidency of Council of Ministers, Andrés Moscaldas, which will be doing the final. Intervention. During the panel, we will have three interventions besides the one that we just heard from Mr. Vice President. But before I give the floor to the next panelist, let me just underline some of the words that were, some of the remarks that were made by Mr. Vice President. I end up saying that we should work together. And I really believe that it is really, really relevant to highlight the fact that the last communication on better regulation that was presented by the Commission has in its title the necessity of coming together, of working together within the European institutions. We will now have three other interventions. The next intervention, it will be by by the member of the European Parliament, Mrs. Maria Manuela Leitão Marques, and she is also Vice Chair of the Committee on the Internal Market and Consumer Protections, and besides that, and one of her many other positions, she is also a member of the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in a Digital Age. Before I give her the word, let me just say one more thing. She's also a professor in economics at Coimbra University in Portugal. And she has been one of the leading persons in Portugal, in Europe and in the world supporting development of regulation and of better regulation for the last decade. So it is a huge pleasure that I give her the floor, sorry.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Manuel, for your words, and thank you to the Secretary of State, André Moscaldas, dear friend, for this invitation. It's my pleasure to be with you to discuss this so important issue. Allow me to make some initial comments, maybe a little bit provocative, on the Commission's communication on better regulation, the last one. And let me be very honest, when I see this new communication, I had a feeling that I was reading the past ones, that we progressed very little and that we were still very far from our initial objectives at European Union level. And if that is the case, and I must tell you that is the case because I deal with this situation every day in the Parliament, maybe we should rethink why this happens. Is this an impossible mission? At the level at European Union legislation, it's different in member states. Considering the complexity of the EU legislative process and procedures and the negotiation and so on, Or should we rethink dramatically and radically the methodology and the tools that we are using to implement better regulation approach at European Union level? But this reflects in the member states, of course, with the regulation and directives too. Why have we progressed so little? First, there is still a widespread idea, at least in certain political groups of the European Parliament, as mine, that better regulation is about less regulation. It's deregulation at all costs. And that principle, one in, one out, it's only about that. It's a rewarding, nice rewarding of the regulatory agenda. So we should fight back on this false idea, in my opinion, in a more explicit manner by showing with very concrete examples how we can use, and we are using at member states level, the better regulation tools to improve the ability of our citizens to exercise their rights, such as in terms of consumer protection, data protection, and so on, workers' protection, and so on. And we need to demonstrate, again with very concrete examples, that better regulation is not just for big companies, and that it is for companies, and that it benefits mostly small and medium enterprise and micro enterprise as well, for which the administrative burdens are great and more difficult to deal with. And let me tell you, maybe I'd be a little bit out of the box. Maybe we should not push that hard on the principle one in, one out. Truth be told, eliminating legislation is not what is most important. What we need is to make it simpler in order to be better enforced. And for that purpose, consolidation, for instance, is a very good step. That is rarely done when it comes to European legislation, because of the silos in the European Commission, because of the silos in the committees here in the Parliament, because of different legal bases and all other aspects that you know very well. I could give you many examples of new legislative files that are in the Parliament, such as the SCA, Digital Service Act, files on customers, single window, cybersecurity, machinery, and the others, full of remissions to other ones. It's a nightmare. Sometimes it's a nightmare to study and to amendment and so on, to be prepared to discuss them. We also need to be more ambitious in the enforcement phases of our legislation, using, as Manuel showed us, technology and special interoperability to reduce administrative burdens. Know about technical tools, this kind of tools that can help us in the phase of in legal drafting and in the phase of conceptualization of new laws. And finally, of course, it's important to use technology to optimize the design and evaluation of the legislation ex ante and ex post, also in what concerns preventing administrative burdens, as Manuel Cabogueira has shown us with this important and very interesting project named AI to impact assessments. And there are other examples in Portugal, such as the project Decoding Legislation. The project aims to develop natural language processing algorithms that would allow for searches and the interpretation of legislation on consumers' rights based on citizens' question in non-technical language. This is being developed by Imprensa Nacional Casa da Moeda, the public undertaking responsible for the official journal of the Portuguese Republic, and if it succeeds, it can be escalated to other pieces of legislation, to other areas of legislation. And this is a very good example because this impacts directly our life, our know of our rights, and the information we have on what we can do if our plane have a big delay, and so on. So, and the data technology can also be a good tool to analyze public consultation and to make sure they are really inclusive. These days, many of the consultations take place online. I think all of them, but this does not mean that they are reaching everyone. And with data technology, it's possible. And Manuel showed us too that who is responding to this consultation, which groups are missing, and to make sure the opinions you are collecting are representative or more representative of the population. It is undeniable that data technology such AI and digital transformation more broadly can bring many benefits to transform our regulatory processes at the European level, much more difficult and at national level. And that we need to embrace them and be bold about it, because the potential is there. We just need to use it, experimenting before scaling with regulatory sandbox and so on. But to do that, we also need digital skills. We need to think digital by default also in thinking. And we need digital skills, not only we need for all the population, not only have more specialists in digital compass. We are hoping to have 20 million people in ICT as ICT specialists in the EU, but we also need digital skills for lawmakers, for people that are working in law procedure in the parliament and in commission, of course, in the council and at national level in the government too. Because without digital literacy, and digital literacy means also artificial intelligence literacy, because nowadays it's in the basic of digital literacy. We need to know what is algorithm, how to ask, how to demand that the algorithm be transparency. What can I ask to know if the data are biased or not biased, and so on, as you know. So let me finish recommending all of you to be ambitious and innovative when it comes to the regulatory processes. We need to make them better and simple through testing and experimentation before scaling. And again, to be honest, unfortunately, this is not what I read in the better regulation communication, what I see every day here in the Parliament. With a very optimistic attitude, I hope to be wrong. But fortunately, this is what Portuguese government is doing. Congratulations. Maybe also member states. And this can push you to be more ambition in these actions to a better regulation, not only on documents such as this communication, but also in action. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Manuel Leitão Marques, thank you very much for the initial intervention. For us that have the opportunity to listen more than once interventions by Professor Maria Manuel Leitão Marques, we know that she's always extremely provocative. A lot of different ideas to start discussing immediately. We will leave it till the end. I would like to inform all the viewers or everyone that is with us following this transmission that you can use the chat to present your questions, to start discussing any issue that you find might be relevant. So please do so. We will be collecting all your comments and we will be collecting all your questions. And at the end, we will open up for a Q&A session, and we'll open up the discussion using, hopefully, not only your questions, but also the comments that you might be placing. And already with these two initial interventions, I believe that there are a lot of different issues that deserve some discussion at least. I will now continue our conference, our panel, giving the floor to Mr. João Tiago Silveira, who is, as it was said at the beginning, in substitution of Helena Shintaki. João Tiago Silveira is the member of the board of the International Association of Legislation. He is also a professor of law in the Faculty of Law of the Lisbon University, where he leads multiple research projects regarding legislative drafting, legislative process and regulation. Also a very well-known person in Portugal in what regards development of all issues related to better regulation and regulation. It is my huge pleasure to give you the floor, João Tiago.
Many thanks, Manuel. I'm really sorry for Ellen not being here with us today. She's well, fortunately, and I'll try to substitute as possible Ellen. It would surely be better for us to have Ellen together with us today, but well, I'll do my best to address issues on legislative impact assessment and artificial intelligence, as I was requested to do. I will first present some remarks on the role of artificial intelligence in the legal arena nowadays. Then I'll try to share with you one or two thoughts on artificial intelligence and legislative impact assessment, which is the focus I believe you want to have in this roundtable. But following Maria Manuel, I will do some final remarks on other IT tools that we have on the top of artificial intelligence and machine learning and other better regulation issues rather than only regulatory impact assessment and legislative impact assessment. Now, legal activities are they have challenges nowadays. One of them is the high volume of information and the higher degree of complexity and expertise to understand the available information. The other one is globalization. If you work in the European Commission, if you work at a European level, if you work in a law firm, you surely understand that nowadays things are getting global and law is getting global. If you want to address an issue on consumers' rights, when you buy online, you need to think globally. If you need to have a new law on taxation of multinational companies, you need to think globally. A huge number of transactions nowadays are global transactions where you may find very easily the law from UK, the law from Germany or France, the Portuguese law. So things are getting global, more interesting, but also more complex. So it's very common to have more than one jurisdiction when you have something to do at the legal level. Very oftenly, you need to understand and share your knowledge with other experts or understand other areas of expertise, such as architecture, energy, environment, chemistry, and so on and so forth. You are not a good lawyer or a good legally trained person if you don't understand the business or the activity besides the law. And people and companies are more demanding, and they are right. They request more clear answers from legally trained persons. They require more clear answers from the law and the regulations. They want speedier court's decision and speedier and simpler answers from public administration, both at European and national levels, and they want reduction of costs. So there are challenges for legal activities, and we need to adapt ourselves. IT tools and also artificial intelligence, analytics, and machine learning is becoming more and more used in legal activities. And we have some examples. For instance, software to analyze and review contracts to detect patterns for due diligence purposes when, for instance, you need or you want to buy a company, to draft and manage contracts, e-discovery tools to deal with high volumes of electronic information or data in documents and case law and doctrine, and also predictive software to predict the outcome of court's decision. Nowadays, you have some law firms or even specialized companies in predicting the court decision for your case. And these tools are becoming more and more used. It's not science fiction that nowadays this is becoming, I wouldn't say, the day-to-day activity in a law firm or in a public administration department, but these tools are more and more used every single year. And let me share with you some examples of that. For instance, there are artificial intelligence robots in China to predict decisions and avoid the presentation of cases before courts. As you see, this highlighted part in Beijing, Shanghai, and Jiangsu, you have artificial intelligence robots able to evaluate the outcome of your file in order for you to understand if you want or not to present your case before courts. So it seems to be a good thing. Now let's look at this second example. Artificial intelligence in China is also used, or at least you have the intention of using it to detect crimes before they happen. So this reminds me something that happened 20 years ago with Tom Cruise and a blockbuster called Minority Report. And it was not such a good thing if you see the blockbuster movie until the end. And I really am very skeptic about the using of artificial intelligence to detect crimes before they happen. But it seems that China wants to do so, as you may see, and you have the links there for you to know a bit more from this. Well, it's not only in China. Nowadays, in the USA, in some states, you want to detect in advance if someone will become a recidivist. So if someone will probably or not commit the same crime again. For you to decide as judge which sentence you think you should apply to such person. And you have algorithms to do so. Guess what? The algorithms seem to have understood and applied the idea that some people with some color tend to commit more crimes than others, which is at least dangerous. But you have this being applied in some US courts and some states. Well, in France, we have a total opposite example, not necessarily for good reasons. And a bill was approved to establish in prison up to 5 years if you evaluate, analyze, compare, or predict judges' practices. It seems that in France, the unions of judges do not like very much of having tools to predict court decisions. And it seems that they even sustained at a certain point that the name of the judge in the sentence should not be shared with persons. Well, at least it seems that they were able to avoid this type of activity on what concerns court's decisions. So this is the total opposite example of the previous cases I showed. In the UK, at least, the special commission created by the president of Law Society seems to be worried about the using of algorithms, as you already shared with us. And I mean, this is really a concern that we should address. They propose a national register of algorithms for criminal justice system. I do not know if this is the answer. What I know is that this is a concern we should address. So machine learning, artificial intelligence, and IT tools are becoming more and more used on what concerns legal activities. And what about legislative impact assessments? What I do not know if legislative impact assessment is necessarily the area where artificial intelligence is more useful. But I can at least share with you that I believe it could be useful for 3-4 types of activities linked to legislative impact assessment and regulatory impact assessment. Impact assessment is commonly criticized for delaying the legislative procedure. It has to deal with extensive amounts of information, data and statistics. And data and statistics and information are frequently found in very different sources, and it's not necessarily easy to detect such sources. So I believe machine learning and using of big data, artificial intelligence may help to provide for an easier collection of data from different sources, the collection of data from sources which are not necessarily available or well organized from an IT point of view, or on what concerns the automation on measuring impacts. This seems more or less obvious, and I'm just saying what I believe to be the obvious. But I would like to share with you a fourth area where legislative impact assessment could benefit from artificial intelligence. I believe one of the big challenges for RIAs and legislative impact assessment is the wider scope for such assessments. Everybody is requesting a broader RIA or a broader legislative impact assessment addressing not only one specific issue, but a huge amount of issues at the red tape level, economical level, environmental level, social level, and even in other topics. But there is, until now, a satisfactory methodology to assess and balance such different values or issues you need to assess. So one of the issues is which methodology can we use to balance together all these new and requested values you need to take into consideration in RIAs or legislative impact assessment. And for example, which methodology is able to measure the impact of biodiversity jointly with the economical cost and benefits of a new framework, a new legislative framework for easing the implementation of wind farms. There is no such methodology. So I wonder if artificial intelligence could be of some help through machine learning, to define a new way of jointly and from a balanced way take into consideration all these different values and create something that could analyze together all these issues, which we do not have yet. So something to think about. Now, let me finish by presenting you two remarks. On the first one on other IT tools for better regulation, and the other one on other better regulation issues on the top of artificial intelligence. Because I think artificial intelligence is not necessarily the key for everything, and impact assessments are also not the truth and the answer for all our problems. First, there are a lot of IT tools which could be very useful and can be much more used, and probably they provide also good responses, probably even better responses for people and companies rather than artificial intelligence. For instance, you can create and use widely, and we have lots of countries where this does not happen. You can use more widely IT tools for legislative drafting to improve clarity and to use more common patterns and more common laws. And this could be also an agenda for the European Union to try to create more precise, clearer, and share some basic rules for legislative drafting, even at national levels. Second example, to ease consultation procedures when preparing laws and regulation by using IT tools for participation, as someone has already said at this conference. And thirdly, to allow for smarter and easier access to legislative information for non-legally trained persons. I wonder if we could not use more IT tools to ease the access of legislation and to prepare clearer legislation for people and companies, even if they are not legally trained. Lastly, well, let's face it, legislative impact assessment is important. I am a supporter of legislative impact assessment efforts, and I think they should be carried out. But let's not try to convince ourselves that this is the key for everything and the more important piece of the better regulation agenda, because perhaps it isn't. On the other hand, to defend legislative impact assessments and RIAs, I think we need to use them when they are useful, and not necessarily and always in all types of bills or all types of regulations. I wonder what have happened if a regulatory impact assessment would have been carried out prior to the decision of sending Vasco da Gama on his journey to discover the way to India. Perhaps we would not send him if we have carried out a cost and benefit analysis, because probably the risks were too high at that stage, that era. And what would have happened if we have carried out an impact assessment and a cost-benefit analysis to decide if the Mosteiro de Jerónimos in Belém, which is a wonderful building, you should visit it in Portugal. At that time, probably it would not resist to cost-benefit analysis. And I really sincerely do hope that we do not carry out any cost-benefit analysis or regulatory impact assessment when deciding if we should travel in our journey to Mars, because I really want that to happen for the mankind and not necessarily based in an impact assessment. So I believe impact assessment should be focused on where it could be really useful and not necessarily for very deep political decisions of this type I've referred to you. On the top of that, we should not forget that good old-fashioned better regulation topics, because I believe they really do provide better services and better tools for companies and citizens. And this is very much to support Maria Manuel's idea that European Union needs to do more on that, on the big old-fashioned cutting red tape and reduction of administrative burdens. Okay, we have communications, we have groups, we have stakeholders, we have policies for impact assessments, but what about that reduction of burdens? I would like to show you two very practical examples of how European Union is still creating burdens. For instance, due to European Union legislation, the driver's license had to be renewed in Portugal every 15 years after you have your driver's license. So people had to pay and to request renewals from public administration much more oftenly than before due to European Union legislation. And second example, due to European Union legislation, we now have mandatory energy performance certificates that people need to have when they buy or lease the house. And I mean, this is not necessarily to oblige you to have works in your home due to energy and energetic efficiency. This is for you to have an expression and pay for a piece of paper that you need to have to buy your house or to sell your house or to lease your house. So it's just a piece of paper that European Union legislation started to request from you, and that brought people and obviously companies to more costs and more bureaucracy. So we need to have a more not only wonderful agendas, but focus our attention in the detail of that burden that is created day to day due to national legislations, but also due to European Union legislations, not only on regulatory impact assessments, which are very important, which I support, not only taking care and good care of using of IT tools, artificial intelligence, and so many others, but also on that old-fashioned reduction of red tape and reduction of administrative burdens. Many thanks, and many thanks to the Portuguese Presidency for this wonderful conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, João Tiago, for your intervention. And thank you not only for underlying the difficulties of using artificial intelligence and data technology in all different aspects of better regulation. We are far, far away from there. Also to underlying where it is useful and where we can use it right now. And at the end, thank you also for taking us back to the basics and to the basic questions that are relevant, related to simplification, to the quality of drafting, and to the main objective of reducing unnecessary burdens. Finally, let me just share that yes, impact assessments should not be used in any situation, but at least in the North American case, it was an impact assessment that gave a negative opinion on the construction of the Death Star, like in Star Wars, and it is a real report on that. But just to share that from time to time, there are different impact assessments, and we can use them to support more difficult decisions. Finally, I will give the floor to the Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, Jeffrey Schlagenhalf, and it is a huge pleasure to give him the floor for many reasons. One of them is that we met a long time ago, many years ago. We actually met having lunch in the cafeteria of the OECD. We start discussing red wine, and I promise you that at some point, I was going to bring you to Lisbon to have true good red wine. It wasn't still now, but I still hope that we will be able to someday have you in Lisbon with us in another conference. Mr. Schlagenhalf, it is a huge pleasure. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I did get a chance to get down to Lisbon before the shutdowns and confinements, and did get to enjoy a little bit of that extraordinary Portuguese wine. But I certainly hope I get the opportunity to come back in the near future. And I do remember the lunch you are discussing. So let me start out by saying, in the context of increased interconnectedness of our economies, rapid innovation, and profound societal changes, governments and regulators need to promote more dynamic, flexible, and technology-neutral approaches to regulations and their enforcement. And I want to pause just briefly there and focus on technology-neutral. This is, in my opinion, a real linchpin. Even if we're dynamic and flexible, if we keep focusing on specific technologies, we're going to always find ourselves trying to regulate and address the past, as opposed to what we need to design for the future. As will be highlighted in the upcoming OECD principles and policy recommendations on agile regulatory governance in order to harness innovation, points out that doing this requires that we seize the opportunities that are offered by digital technologies and data analysis. The various technological solutions implemented across countries to improve regulatory capacity during the COVID-19 crisis show digital technology's potential to help resource-constrained governments and regulators develop more effective and efficient rulemaking amid increased uncertainty. In the same vein, the OECD Global Conference on Governance Innovation showed that governments and regulators are increasingly adapting their approaches by capitalizing on innovation to improve regulatory design and delivery. More recently, in their responses to the survey on experiences with regulatory impact assessments related to emerging technologies, our OECD members confirmed their strong interest in benefiting from using technology to improve their regulatory impact assessment process by strengthening its evidence base and enhancing its efficiency. For example, thanks to big data. Ultimately, such improvements are expected to improve regulatory quality by making it more efficient, effective, and digital ready. One of the great benefits of the digital transformation is for governments themselves to seize its opportunities to increase their regulatory capacity. And here is an American I sometimes like to say, increasing regulatory capacity shouldn't be confused with increasing regulatory quantity, to foster innovation and promote the public interest. The digital age offers new approaches to resource-constrained governments and regulators for more effective and efficient rulemaking. In this context, leveraging new sources of data and continuous monitoring to better understand the effects of regulations and thus produce broader, more reliable, and timely assessments of the impacts of regulations is essential. In the same vein, governments are now able to capitalize on the opportunities offered by digital technologies and the emergence of new data sources to help develop, monitor, and enforce more outcome-focused and innovation-friendly regulatory approaches. As an example, artificial intelligence allows regulators to leverage data from an increasing variety of sources and to conduct more complex data analysis, to cut through information problems and improve the design and evaluation of regulations. Digital technologies combined with advanced data analysis techniques can also help to better target inspections and enforcement activities. Data-driven approaches can be instrumental in identifying, assessing, and managing risks. Numerous examples of such developments exist in areas such as financial market regulation, natural species conservation, or food chain regulations, just to name a couple. Although innovative technologies and data analysis can be governments' best allies by helping them to design and execute public policy interventions based on evidence and commensurate to levels of risk, a recent OECD review of existing practices shows that there are a number of obstacles to the digitalization of regulatory delivery. These belong to three main categories: legal, institutional, and technological. First, legal. The scope and the construct of the regulations can lead to a lack of incentives for digitalizing regulatory delivery. For example, prescriptive regulations may not provide sufficient flexibility for targeted inspections. Second, institutional. The structures governing the operation of regulators, such as powers and responsibilities, as well as their institutional culture and capacity, may inhibit their ability to develop and implement data-driven interventions. Technological, chiefly relating to data availability, governance, and infrastructure. The COVID-19 crisis has shed new light on some of these barriers, but also introduced even stronger incentives for governments to overcome them and thus bring about change in the regulatory delivery models in order to be able to use the full potential of innovative solutions and ultimately serve their citizens better. The OECD will continue to support governments in that undertaking by further promoting data-driven approaches to both rulemaking and regulatory delivery, as well as strong institutional cooperation to help spread promising practices and address potential cross-border challenges. Thanks again for the opportunity to join you today, and I look forward to sharing that glass of Portuguese wine with you in Lisbon someday. Thank you.
Mr. Stagenhalf, thank you very much for your intervention, and thank you for all the work that the OECD has been doing. We have been working together with the OECD, developing our own projects and our own program on better regulation for many years, and you have been a reference in good practices and especially in the sharing good practice throughout the world. Thank you very much. I'll thank the three interventions. We definitely had three very different interventions. We started with a very lively intervention regarding the ongoing implementation of better regulation at the European level, and which made very clear what are the difficulties and challenges that we face at European level when we discuss better regulation within the European institutions. We had a second intervention that also made very clear the challenges, the risks and difficulties and the limitations of using new approaches when we look at the overall better regulation and when we want to implement the best practices, and again, we are still far away from being able to use these new approaches when we talk about cost-benefit analysis or anything related to that. But it was made very clear all the limitations that we have, and we now had a final intervention giving us an overall view of how data technology can support the different moments of the regulatory process, regulatory cycle, and how we can build on those technologies to improve the overall regulatory cycle. I will now like very much to share with you some of the questions that we already have, some of the questions that were raised in our chat. But before I do that, and this is very difficult to do because I cannot see all the different panelists, but I'll do my best. I will start by asking if anyone would like to make a comment on the overall interventions, or if I shall immediately go forward with a first question, and I will just place a question and we'll ask who wants to open the floor. From what I can see, there are no parallel comments that our panelists will want to make. In that sense, I will go forward with the first question. And the first question is a question on a more optimistic approach to the data technologies. We heard on the different interventions that data technologies bring a lot of risks, that data technologies bring a lot of difficulties, especially when it comes to the necessity to defend human values and prevent any kind of negative impact on individual values. But I will ask you if any one of you will see a positive way where new data technologies could improve better regulation when it comes to the relation between the public decider and the citizens and the firms. So if and the question that was made is if there is any positive contribution from data technologies to better regulations in respect to respecting civil rights and in respect to promoting a better approach between public decision making and the stakeholders and the citizens. I don't know if anyone would like to share some thoughts on this.
Here, because I think this goes right to the core of one of our biggest challenges right now. We've seen citizens declining trust in governments, institutions, and I think that unfortunately, because of sometimes government's haphazard approach and constantly shifting narratives, we've seen that trust eroded further during the pandemic. So I think that ensuring that citizens trust the way that their data is going to be used by government or others is extremely important. This means you've got to have a very robust, both legal and regulatory framework to ensure that the data is protected, people know about what it's being used for. And we actually did a report not too long ago at the OECD talking about the path to being a data-driven public sector. And here we make the case again for the need for a very coherent and integrated approach to data governance frameworks and the data strategies that go with that. So I think this shows a lot of the ways governments are looking to accomplish this because of the need to address ethics, privacy, and the consent of citizens on how the data is being used, as well as transparency and security issues. I also think that sort of what our research shows is that there's tremendous opportunity to improve stakeholder engagement in the regulatory process. And I think there's some examples and experiments that have been looked at, such as crowd-law initiatives or sort of crowdsourced law drafting. From my background, I think of this as sort of a way to take advantage of a book that was written many years ago that talks about the wisdom of crowds. And I think finding a way to engage the wisdom of the crowd, the wisdom of the citizens in this process, and in engaging stakeholders is extraordinarily important in looking at the way forward to make this whole notion of regulatory reform of the process actually work.
Thank you very much. Any follow-up comments?
Very, very short comment, Manuel, if I can. I think trust is crucial when we discuss about data, as you prefer. And it's why we are working here in Parliament on Data Act and Data Governance Act, that is the new regulation. And in order to keep trust in this application, in the use of AI and the use of our data, especially the personal one, but also data of things, we need to be more transparent about these applications, and special to develop use of data that improve our life. If I say to a patient that the data of him or her are going to be used to improve cancer diagnosis or treatments, or if I say someone that the data could be used to prevent failure in schools, this is a project that are being developed in Portugal, for instance, it could be a way to improve trust on these new technologies. And also, as we are going to do with the regulation on artificial intelligence, we need to distinguish high-risk application and lower-risk applications of AI. One problem for me is when we regulate BSA or AI regulation and so on, or data, as technology are being developed so fast, how to introduce flexibility in regulation in order it fit for purpose. Because a regulation takes a long time to be approved in the European Commission, in European institutions, maybe 1 year or more, sometimes more than that, much more.
Thank you very much for the comments. And yes, it is a challenge to understand how we can make regulation more flexible so that we do not suffer from legislative delay and lag. João Tiago, any comment?
Yes, I think on what concerns data, you can see it from different perspectives. I'll try to give you 2 or 3 very different perspectives when referring the using of data to improve your life as citizens or companies. The first one is against the use of your data. Let's face it, we do not have tools to react very quickly on a speedy way against the wrong use of your data. If tomorrow I'm putting information about Manuel in a Nazi website referring that Manuel Cabreira is a Nazi, awful Nazi, due to this conference, he does not have a tool provided by the states at national level or European Union to quickly react against that. Partially due to globalization again, because very often we are talking about phenomena which is not only national, because this website may be a website from a different jurisdiction. So this is one of the, I think, answers that we need to have at European level, which is not only to regulate in a very detailed manner the use of your data and GDPR and so on, but legal mechanisms and entities to in a very speedy way provide protection for people and companies against these abuses. The second perspective is how can you wisely use your data to provide trust for your citizens. And honestly, I think it is a good thing to use it for consultation procedures when you produce laws and so on and so forth. But what creates trust in your company and citizens is a good public service. And you can use this information as long as you follow certain rules and good practices to provide better services, public services for your services. For instance, on what concerned vaccination here in Portugal and in other countries, we had a very good practice that we tried to implement in many public administration services, which is the public administration to address directly with the citizen before the citizens request something to public administration. Very oftenly, the National Health Service contacted directly the person saying that he has his vaccine scheduled for a certain day, a certain hour, and a certain place. Why do not we use this kind of practice for a lot of other services? For instance, to renew your ID card, to renew your driver's license. We could do so, and we can do so. And this is also about use of your data. So I believe the wise use of your data can provide much better, enhanced, better regulated, and public services with no red tape. Okay.
If I can, Manuel, only yes. to add a small point I forgot before, that is very important, and we are working here in the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence of the Parliament, that is data altruism, data donation, and data dividend. And for some purpose, special for research and so on, we need also to increase this data altruism and with more transparency in the results and sometimes data dividends.
Very interesting element, because we should also discuss data as maybe we could discuss data as an economic good and how it could be transacted in the market. But before we get into that, and just going a step back to the intervention of João Tiago that mentioned the GDPR and mentioned the questions regarding the preservation of individual data. At the same time, it was already said by, I believe, everyone that if we want to use new technologies, artificial intelligence, we should have more data, more transparent data, data flows, reuse data. And João Tiago gave examples of how we could reuse data to be more efficient at the public service level. To have loops of knowledge, we again should be able to assess data and use it in ways that it will learn from itself and it will provide more information. My question is, all this to change and to use data in so many ways, how we can combine that with rules that, for instance, are being established by the GDPR. And I'm making this question because the question was made by Manuel Gameiro from the Portuguese Industrial Confederation, and I appreciate the fact that she is with us and she made the question. So how can we coordinate the GDPR and the necessity of using data to support all the artificial intelligence machine? Any comments? And I do understand that every time that we talk about GDPR, everything becomes more difficult.
Yeah, of course, we can coordinate by consent, and this is in the GDPR too, and the use of data for scientific purpose. And also we need to improve the consent, because sometimes the consent is not very clear for people that are allowing their data being used for other purposes, but we can improve this phase, and also by this kind of mechanisms I referred before of data donation and data altruism.
Thank you very much. And if there are no other comment on the relation between GDPR and the use of data, new data technologies, I have a follow-up question regarding the new approaches to regulation and the innovative approach to regulation. And I would like I will combine two different questions. The first of them is, once we face lack of transparency in the use of algorithms to implement impact assessment, once there is this difficulty of the common citizens to understand how its own data is being used, once we know that if we go further with machine learning processes and we go into deep learning, it is even difficult to understand exactly how the machine is producing information and providing information. My first question is, how should we guarantee the protection of the citizen in face of so many difficulties regarding transparency? Should we regulate more? Should we regulate the use of these new technologies and have the risk of not allowing them to develop? And I'm asking this because it was one of the questions that was presented, and besides that, because we have now a proposal of a first proposal of regulation of regulating the use of impact of artificial intelligence at the European level. A second question, which is more or less related to this one, is if we could look at the new approaches of innovative regulation, like sandboxes, innovative regulatory hubs, before starting to regulate and before starting to use these new tools in the broad perspective, to start to actually have the opportunity to implement them in a very local way, which will allow not only for the private initiative to experiment with new technologies, but at the same time for the regulators to observe what are the impacts, what are the necessities, and what will be the demands to regulate those kinds of instruments. So these two different questions. First, how and should we regulate artificial intelligence and the new technologies? And the second one, how and should we use these new innovative approaches like sandboxes and regulatory hubs to allow these new technologies to develop? Any comments?
Yeah, well, on the second issue, I think we should deregulate by approving a law, and very oftenly you need to deregulate by creating a new legislative provision. Maria Manuel, she's laughing because she knows what I'm about to say. And it is an extremely good idea and good practice to allow for experiences in public administration and in the private sector by not having a regulated environment for some purposes. Maria Manuel, when she was a minister, I believe, approved the law allowing for this type of practice in Portugal. This law is a new law, which has an annex with a list of activities where you can have your experiences as if it would be in a deregulated environment. I wonder if we shouldn't do the same in other countries and probably in European level also. Well, on the first question, I think it is a very extremely difficult question to answer. But what I'm very much against is of accepting that somebody, just to be a good name or something that everybody talks about, is necessarily good or a good idea. I refuse to accept that artificial intelligence, it is a good thing just because everybody talks about artificial intelligence. So obviously it will have its upsides and downsides. It has and presents opportunities. It may be an extremely good thing for some purposes, and it can be an extremely bad idea for some others. What I think we need to focus on is not on accepting necessarily something just because it has the words technology or is something that everybody talks about. I think we need to be wise and understand where it can help, where it will help, where it will present problems that we don't want to face, we should not to face, and prior to decide if we want to regulate it or not, to decide wisely where it can be more useful. Just that.
I totally agree with João Tiago. Of course, we need experimental moments of different regulation or moments with less regulation, areas controlled, experiment, doing proofs of concept and pilots. Before, I remember with João Tiago, this is not common for public administration. Our tradition is to decide for everybody at the same moment, all the country. But João did that when it was in the government with so disruptive innovation in registries, in different areas, experimenting and correcting, doing in a controlled area, in a controlled system, well observed. Other idea that I don't agree is that all the regulation is against innovation. This is not true. Innovation is good. If it is for good, it is for us. But sometimes we need regulated innovation. Innovation is not. We need sometimes to control the pace of innovation in order no people is left behind. In order to keep trust of our people, of our companies, of our citizens. So innovation and regulation can go together. And artificial intelligence is a very good example. Here in the special committee, we discuss a lot on the application of artificial intelligence in cancer, in agriculture, in the public services, only to give you the three last section of either committee and different application. And in this proposal, they arrived 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, that we distinguish between high-risk application with personal data in health and lower risk application. Because when we speak about artificial intelligence, we are speaking about a chatbot to tell me the timetable of trains, for instance, or something more risky. So I totally agree with João Tiago that we need to a more complex discussion about this word, fashionable word, artificial intelligence and data. And I think the European model can be very well balanced as it was for protection of data. What I am a little bit worried is how we are going to prepare ourselves in our public administration to deal with this new regulation on the Digital Service Act, Digital Markets Act, Data Governance Act, Data Act that are going to come, artificial intelligence and so on. Looking at some public administration, I'm a little bit concerned how to prepare our public service and managers to these new realities and new regulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree very much with the comments that have been made. You ask even very well-informed people in this area what artificial intelligence is, and they can mean very different things. For me, it's easy in one way. I can say that if somebody asked me what artificial intelligence was, I would say, look at the US Congress. And say it from the standpoint of having worked there. I do think we have to recognize that the actual on-the-ground regulators, a lot of time, they struggle with the fact that legislative bodies are never really clear at what they're looking to accomplish. And there's always the legislative deal where they sort of like obfuscate or don't make clear what the mandate is sometimes. So people are looking to address something that maybe isn't a clearly defined problem. So I think that's very important there. And I also think the other danger here, which was alluded to in maybe a different way, is that when something becomes so popular and is seen as such a good thing, that people don't really step back and say, are the models or the algorithms sound that are being used to implement these type of things? It may not fall into the artificial intelligence category. We can look back at the financial collapse and the way we had financial firms designing products that the math was totally there. They weren't big term risk. And we saw very large, powerful companies collapse simply because their models weren't sound. Their approach to what isn't sound. So I do think we look at implementing AI and other things like that. We need to be very conscious of the sort of tail risk in the activities that we're engaging in.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And yes, we should be careful with the enthusiasm that we sometimes enroll just because everybody is faced with a new reality and likes and wants to be part of a new approach or a new wave or a new perspective. I have just one final question, and the question that I would like to make, and this is my question. The question that I would like to make is how can we improve regulatory quality in Europe when we have a regulatory change that comes from a proposal by the Commission to the implementation at the local level. And it is always difficult for me to understand how we can actually improve regulatory quality throughout the complete chain and make sure that it is effective, efficient and equitable at the end of the day. To make that question within this conference, I will add two different aspects. First is if we can use data technology, for instance, to analyze or to better analyze that chain and to, for instance, identify gold plating situations. And the second question, which I believe it is more relevant, taking into account the Commission reports and communications on the data strategy, is and also keeping in mind for the intervention by the different interventions today, we do know that to have quality and to be effective and efficient in an intervention, we should not only look at the initial drafting phase of the regulation, but we should also look at the implementation and the monitorization of the implementation. But to do so at European level, we must have data that goes to the local level. And the question is, will it be possible to create a data space at European level where not only member states but also European institutions are well informed about the impacts of their decisions?
Good idea. It's a good idea because we are discussing about data space for energy, data space for mobility, data space for health. We are working Commission, DG Santé and DG Connect are working in data space for health. Why not a data space to better improve or better implement European regulation? It's a possibility, why not? But it's better to use maybe also what I would like to propose, because João knows very well that it is something we never have been able to simplify, that is the legislation concerning European funds. It's a nightmare, not for the big companies, but for the small ones that would like to apply for them. And this is very important now with the Recovery and Resilience Plan to simplify the regulation, is a lot of them, of European funds. And this is at European level, and why not use this case to experiment new technologies to a better control, to more transparency, but less bureaucracy.
Yes, I would add that a data space is probably a good expression and a very fashion expression, but then you need to know what's inside the data space, and that's the real difficulty. What can help? I would say on your topic, on the implementation, that practical handbooks of Q&A on how to implement European Union legislation could be a good thing if they are used more often. Sometimes documents are prepared, probably they would need to be prepared systematically. The Council of Europe, not the European Union, has a very good practice of handbooks on how to implement recommendations from Council of Europe. Perhaps it could be more used. Second example, we have a research project in Lisbon Law School on how to create a specific methodology for regulatory impact assessment on gold plating. Well, we don't know yet if there is the need for a specific methodology to measure gold plating. But if there is, perhaps we should create, let me use a fashionable word that is very much appreciated in the European Union, a toolkit for impact assessment when new procedures are set up by directives or regulations, and how to avoid at national level the creation of gold plating. Third, I would be very much in favor of an European Union entity to fight against gold plating and acting directly with the national member states. I probably will not say more on this topic because perhaps a lot of people will think that I'm too radical, and I'm really in favor of enhancing European Union on this type of things. But Manuel, the issue here is not only on implementation and execution, is very much on the preparation of European Union legislation. Maria Manuel said something in the beginning which is very important. The European Union and the European Commission acts in silos, and very oftenly the Commission departments deal directly with national entities. and not all of them have better regulation principles and cutting red tape agendas in their minds. Sometimes what they have in their minds is an allowance to have to renew your driver's license more oftenly, because this brings more revenues for public administration at national levels, and perhaps the entities in the European Union will agree on creating harmonized rules on renew driver's license. And sometimes, not to say very often, this creates new burdens on this discussion between general directorates and European Commission and public agencies or general directorates at national level, without a political point of view presented and addressed right from the beginning when you start to prepare a new bill. Perhaps European Union better regulation responsibles should look and interfere right in the beginning of the preparation of a new bill at European Union level.
Thank you. Mr. Schlangenhalf, any last comments?
No, I don't have any last comments other than I think this was a great event.
Thank you.
And good discussion, important issue. I look forward to continuing the discussion over a glass of wine.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I hopefully will find a way of meeting as soon as possible to have a glass of wine here in Portugal. Regarding the last proposal by João Tiago, just to say that I agree fully. The only little proposal that I will make is that I will not call it a European Organization for Gold Plating. I will call it a European Organization for Transparent Transposition, which leaves open more opportunities. But I fully agree. Let me finalize by thank you all for participating. Everyone that is following us through the internet, thank you very much. We will have now a final address, but before that, thank you, Mrs. Maria Manuel Leitão Marques. Maria Manuel, thank you very much for your interventions. Mr. João Tiago Silveira, thank you very much for your interventions, João Tiago. And Mr. Jeffrey Schlangenhalf. Jeffrey, thank you very much again. Thank you. It was a very interesting discussion. I learned a lot. I had a lot of fun, and that for me it's the most important thing. And I will now give the floor for the final intervention in our conference from the Secretary of State of the Presidency of the Council of Ministers, Mr. André Mos Caldas.
Thank you, Professor Manuel Cabogueira. Dear distinguished guests, Maria Manuel Leitão Marques, João Tiago Silveira, and Jeffrey Schlangenhalf, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to start by expressing my deepest appreciation to our speakers and all those that participated in this very stimulating discussion about the future of regulatory impact assessment in support of a more effective lawmaking. As already mentioned, we couldn't have Vice President Maroš Šefčovič live with us, but I would like to thank him for the message he sent, conveying the Commission priorities on the topic of our conference. And to Professor Helen Zantaki, Chair of the International Association of Legislation, to whom I am also grateful and wish a speedy and full recovery. And many thanks to Professor João Tiago Silveira, a predecessor of mine that continues to inspire me, and a dear friend, for stepping in for Professor Zantaki in a particularly short notice. I should also like to take this opportunity to thank our trio colleagues, Jeremy and Slovenia, that also wish to place better regulation high on our agenda and hand in hand with a discussion on the relevance of new data technologies. Sadly, the COVID-19 pandemic made it impossible to organize a physical meeting in Portugal, but technology still made us possible to change views in these matters. Earlier today, we have tackled the issue of how new technologies can support and render more efficient and flexible legislative cycles by focusing on the future of impact assessment analysis. We cannot stress enough the importance of technology in lawmaking processes across time. The evolution regarding the sources of law, and by this I mean bodies that produce legal norms or their manifestations, although sometimes seen merely as an evolution stemming from jurisprudence or legal thinking, is indeed deeply linked with leaps in technology. Legislation as a source of law in ancient Rome only made its way of affirmation as reproduction of legal precepts became easier, from rocks and boards to folios and books, a technological leap at that time. In the modern era, legislation as a manifestation of the will of the monarchs only surpassed customary law or tradition with the invention of the press, a huge technological leap back then. The past teaches not to turn a blind eye to the impact of the evolution of technology in lawmaking. The next major transformation in the sources of law will be that resulting from digitization, even if we are not yet able to identify the specific sense that such transformation will take, if it will lead or not to the emergence of a new primordial source of law. For now, we can at least try to interpret the signs we see developing, and so we did this afternoon in terms of better regulation. From our discussions, it has become clear that further and stronger cooperation is needed in what regards the future of regulatory impact assessment. And not only between governments and legislatures, but also with the civil society, the academy, and other stakeholders. The social, political, and economic transformations that our society has gone through entail institutional consequences, from which new challenges are arising, but also new opportunities. New public policy and its impact assessment must take into account the speed of change and the speed of communication and information. The introduction of artificial intelligence as a work tool is a great opportunity. Following the European Commission Communications 2030 Digital Compass Communication of 9th March and Better Regulation Joining Forces to Make Better Laws of 29th April, the Presidency has worked on highlighting the contribution of the digital transformation through artificial intelligence and data science, which will help to improve impact assessment. But let me tell you first about our national experience. In Portugal, the Artificial Intelligence for Impact Assessment project, currently under development by the Legislative Impact Assessment Technical Unit, will allow for the first time to introduce machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithms in the process of estimating the costs of new legal solutions. Policymakers will thus be better informed about costs and other impacts of draft legislation. On the other hand, the use of text mining algorithms in the legal system, taking advantage of the potential of the large amount of information currently available, using advanced computational methods, may help filtering and extracting information towards a better representation of the legal norms and regulations. At the same time, it can make it easier for legislators and citizens to understand existing obligations, as well as the consequences of new norms already adopted or soon to be. That's why we wanted to look at the future of impact assessment and better lawmaking, taking into consideration both the old and new challenges with regards to its main goal: providing information that supports the decision-making process and thus allowing policymakers to make better and more efficient regulation. It is usually accepted that more information takes us one step closer to better regulation. However, it must also recall that governments frequently handle pressure points and deal with pressing realities that must be quickly dealt with. The COVID-19 pandemic, in all its aspects and consequences, is an obvious example. But so is true of the deadlines regarding other obligations, as is the case of EU directives transposition. Those factors often end up weighing against a better decision, and by better, I mean one that will be effective, efficient, and measured in its effects. We must face this issue. We must recognize that lawmaking does not always, if ever, happen in ideal circumstances, and so we must endeavor to have, in a time-sensitive manner, not only adequate data, but also data presented with clear and effective indicators. This, I am sure, will help not only governments and legislators in decision-making, but also help stakeholders and the people to better understand how decisions were taken and to better understand the public interest behind the norms and decisions. That's also why we must ensure that while impact assessments promote legal interventions that are fit for purpose and fit for future, it remains in itself a fit for purpose and fit for future exercise. It gives us confidence when facing the never-ending challenges of governments in name and in the interest of the people, and thus working towards a more perfect democracy. During the Portuguese presidency, it became clear throughout the discussion in the Working Party on better regulation that there is a role for data technology in support of the legislative process. Big data and artificial intelligence were recognized as relevant tools that may contribute to a more effective, more efficient, less time-consuming, and more robust impact assessments, evaluations, and foresight analysis. If done properly, if the full potential of these new tools is tapped, it will help legislators implement regulations that are more flexible, more responsive, and adapted to the needs of the economy and those of the less visible social and economic groups like micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Indeed, the impact on regulation on the less visible has been something our government decided to tackle. In 2016, after implementing its own impact assessment framework by analyzing impacts on business companies, we then moved towards assessing the impact on citizens. I am honored to recall that our dear guest, Maria Manuela Leitão Marques, who we humbly follow, was the minister in charge at the time. Afterwards, we introduced other dimensions of analysis, namely impacts on gender, poverty, corruption, and towards groups with disabilities. And earlier this year, we added climate change. We will also start to implement our new support platform for the impact assessment exercise, which I expect will be ready later this year, following the new toolbox guidelines that the European Commission provided through the Structural Reform Support Programme and in close cooperation with the OECD. And this brings me back to new tools and developing technologies. We have been tackling significant steps towards the use of standardized statistical information in support of impact assessment analysis, while looking at the creation of new instruments that, through machine and deep learning, can develop artificial intelligence algorithms, which in turn may help identifying administrative costs of legal proposals. However, and I would like to be clear about this point I often stress, we do not believe on a pure jury metrics approach, based on an algorithmic understanding of the law that celebrates logic as the sole ingredient for proper legal argumentation. We must never forget that lawmaking starts and ends with a human-centered approach. That's also why, while acknowledging that data technologies could help improve risk assessment and thus make regulation more responsive to a fast-changing world, we must foster transparency and the reuse of data in accordance with the Open Data Directive and the General Data Protection Regulation on national and EU level, as was today discussed. These shared beliefs are one of the main reasons why we look confidently ahead in challenging the Commission to include the use of data technologies in its better regulation toolbox to support lawmaking, from impact assessments to the activities under the Regulatory Fitness Programme, as stated on the Council conclusions on data technologies to improve better regulation adopted just a few days ago. It's our job to ensure citizens' security while meeting their legitimate expectations regarding the risks associated with data protection, privacy, and integrity, at the same time that we ensure non-discriminatory approaches firmly grounded on human dignity, better targeted to the needs, perceptions, and expectations of citizens, administrations, and businesses. And that is also one of the main reasons why we are so glad that a consensus was created around the view that better regulation must take a global and overarching approach in order to contribute to growth, competitiveness, social well-being, and, among others, to the Union's green and digital transition and the proper functioning of the single market. In the European Commission communication on better regulation, joining forces to make better laws, we can feel the spirit of the interinstitutional agreement on better regulation when calling for the co-legislators and the member states to come together in promoting better lawmaking, doing their part on the production of better European legislation. We believe that the Council has its own role to play in this effort, and for that we must keep on raising awareness to the important role that impact assessment plays whenever making political decisions, and calling for the co-legislators and member states to not only come together, but to engage with civil society. Thank you very much.
Portugal assume a presidência do Conselho da União Europeia durante o primeiro semestre de 2021. É a oportunidade para promover uma agenda atual para a União Europeia, indo ao encontro dos cidadãos europeus, das suas ambições, dos seus interesses e assuntos, dos desafios globais que têm impacto nas suas vidas. É um reencontro dos Estados-membros numa altura de extrema importância para a coesão e solidariedade da equipa europeia em torno dos seus valores, metas e objetivos de crescimento. As transformações que se fazem sentir em todo o mundo e nos afetam a todos merecem da União Europeia respostas sustentáveis, responsáveis, globais. A presidência portuguesa vai destacar a forma global e integrada com que a União Europeia responde aos grandes desafios da modernidade. A Europa social, a transformação digital, as preocupações ambientais, a abertura a outras regiões do mundo. A resiliência da Europa assenta na solidez das suas respostas e modelos de desenvolvimento, que colocam os cidadãos no centro do projeto europeu e que contam com a coesão e solidariedade das suas comunidades para superar as adversidades, nunca deixando ninguém para trás. Portugal assume a presidência do Conselho da União Europeia com a naturalidade da sua liderança, no diálogo com outras regiões do globo e com os seus exemplos de boas práticas nas políticas de desenvolvimento, demonstrando a resiliência do modelo social europeu. Portugal vai projetar uma mensagem de solidariedade e de confiança no futuro, promovendo o país na Europa e no mundo, destacando a sustentabilidade ambiental e social, a globalização responsável, o acesso à tecnologia e à digitalização. A partir do Centro Cultural de Belém, centro operacional da Presidência, as atividades e reuniões vão alargar-se a outras cidades de Portugal e a palcos virtuais por streaming e videoconferência com outros Estados-membros. Uma presidência digital em que a tecnologia e a inovação aproximam a Europa e os cidadãos. Esta visão integrada afirma Portugal como protagonista global aberto ao mundo, que assume o seu papel condutor da União Europeia por ocasião da presidência. Presidência portuguesa do Conselho da União Europeia. Tempo de agir por uma recuperação justa, verde e digital.